Imagine a world where the people entrusted with your safety, the ones sworn to protect and serve, are the very ones betraying you. In every city, behind every badge, there's a darker side to the stories we're told. What happens when law enforcement, the very institution built to uphold justice, becomes the perpetrator of the very crimes it's meant to prevent? These are the stories of corruption, brutality, and shocking cover-ups within the very systems designed to protect us. From police officers who use their badges as shields for their darkest actions, to entire departments working in the shadows to bury the truth, these cases will leave you questioning the very foundation of the justice system. This isn't just about a few bad apples. This is a deep dive into the terrifying reality of a broken system. Buckle up, because what you're about to uncover might change everything you thought you knew about law enforcement. Welcome to the most shocking police scandals, where the truth is often more chilling than fiction. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of betrayal, exposing the heart of a system that failed those it was meant to protect. The death of Elisa, a case of police brutality and cover-up. In a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago, a young woman's life was snatched away in an instant. Elisa had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no reason to fear the police. Yet, one fateful night, she found herself in the crosshairs of an encounter that would spiral into one of the most chilling cases of police brutality and cover-up the city had ever seen. It was a cold evening in December when Elisa, out with a group of friends at a local bar, decided to drive herself home. The night was uneventful at first. She had no idea that a simple traffic stop would soon escalate into something much darker. When she made an unintentional lane change, the flashing lights behind her startled her, and she pulled over to the side of the road. Elisa was well within her rights. She wasn't drunk or impaired. She had made no traffic violation that warranted suspicion. But from the moment the officers approached her vehicle, everything started to go terribly wrong. The police officer's demeanor was immediately hostile, and Elisa's instinct to stay calm began to backfire. Despite her respectful responses, the situation began to escalate when the officer ordered her out of the car. Elisa complied, though visibly shaken, as the officer's voice grew louder. At some point, a second officer arrived at the scene, and the exchange became more aggressive. Elisa, nervous and scared, attempted to explain herself, but the officers were uninterested in her words. They accused her of evading arrest, a charge she hadn't even been made aware of. Then, without warning, one of the officers grabbed Elisa by the arm, twisting it behind her back. The other officer drew his taser. Within seconds, the situation turned violent. Elisa, despite being unarmed and non-confrontational, was thrown to the ground. She screamed for help, but the sound of her cries was drowned out by the loud buzzing of the taser. The officers, already on edge, didn't stop there. They continued to apply force. Too much force, far beyond what the situation warranted. By the time the paramedics arrived at the scene, it was too late. Elisa was dead. The officers claimed that she had tried to resist arrest, that she had been a threat. But the truth was far from their story. The department quickly went into damage control mode. Internal reports were filled out, but inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses who had been nearby came forward, saying Elisa had not resisted. Some had even seen the officers use excessive force long before Elisa had a chance to fight back. The footage from nearby security cameras, though blurry, did not match the official police account. Elisa had been killed in cold blood, and the officers involved knew it. As the investigation began to gain traction, a cover-up started to unfold. The police department tried to discredit the witnesses, claiming they had a biased agenda or were lying. The officers involved were placed on paid leave, pending an investigation, a move that felt like a waiting game for the public. As more pressure mounted on the department, things began to unravel. Elisa's family, heartbroken and determined for justice, began to fight back. They filed a lawsuit demanding a thorough investigation into the death of their loved one. But the police had one final card to play, a card that almost sent the case into oblivion. The officers involved had falsified their reports, manipulating timelines and actions, trying to make it seem as if Elisa had been the aggressor. The more investigators dug, the more they realized just how deep the rot went. Evidence was tampered with, key testimonies were suppressed, and the department used its considerable power to make sure Elisa's death would be brushed aside. However, the mounting public outcry and mounting pressure from human rights organizations were too powerful to ignore. The evidence, despite their best efforts, came to light. The police were forced to open a new investigation, and this time, they couldn't control the narrative. The officers involved were brought to trial, and after months of legal battles, they were finally convicted of manslaughter. But by then, Elisa's family had already lost more than just a daughter. They had lost faith in the very system meant to protect them. And though justice had been served in a court of law for many, it felt like the price of truth had been too steep. The question that lingered in the air long after the trial ended was simple. How many more lives had been destroyed before Elisa's? How many more cases of police brutality would remain covered up until it was too late? The murder of Kajieme Powell, the unfolding of a tragedy. Kajieme Powell, a young man in his 20s, had a difficult life. He had struggled with mental health issues, battled with homelessness, and lived in the tough neighborhoods of St. Louis. But on a hot summer day in 2014, his life would take a tragic turn that would become a symbol of police overreach and escalation, a sad reminder of how a momentary encounter with law enforcement could spiral into a fatal event. It was a routine 911 call. Someone was causing a disturbance, reportedly stealing drinks from a store. Kajieme had been seen walking out of a gas station with items he hadn't paid for, possibly out of sheer desperation. But this was a man, mentally ill and homeless, struggling with far deeper issues. The responding officers, 2 white officers, were not aware of the complexity of the situation they were walking into. All they knew was that a suspect was on the loose, and they were sent to handle the situation. As they approached Kajieme, they ordered him to stop, but he kept walking, seemingly confused. The officers told him to get on the ground. Kajieme, unarmed, began to pace back and forth, his body language erratic. At that moment, the officers made a critical decision that would haunt them forever. Instead of de-escalating the situation, they drew their weapons. The officers demanded Kajieme get on the ground again, but when he didn't comply, they opened fire. In a matter of seconds, Kajieme was on the ground, his body riddled with bullets. The officers later claimed that Kajieme had been threatening them with a knife. But the truth was far murkier. A bystander had captured the entire event on video, and as the footage spread across the internet, the horrifying truth came into focus. Kajieme had never posed a threat. He was simply confused and agitated. He hadn't had a knife in his hand, nor had he advanced on the officers. The footage painted a chilling picture. The officers had escalated a relatively harmless situation into an execution. What followed was a tragic sequence of events. The police department, in full damage control mode, quickly circulated its narrative. Kajieme was dangerous, and the officers had acted in self-defense. But the more the footage spread, the more the public saw through the lies. Protests erupted across St. Louis, echoing a familiar refrain heard in cities across America: Black Lives Matter. The murder of Kajieme Powell, like so many others, was no isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that often treated the mentally ill and vulnerable as threats. The department tried to cover its tracks. They claimed the officers had followed proper protocol, that the use of lethal force had been justified. Yet the community wasn't buying it. The video had become a powerful tool, one that not only captured Kajieme's tragic end, but also shone a light on the systemic issues that had allowed it to happen. Kajieme had been a troubled young man, yes, but he did not deserve to die that day. The officers involved were never charged. Their actions were deemed justified, and they were allowed to walk free. But for Kajieme's family, and for the thousands of others who protested his death, the story didn't end there. The trial of Kajieme Powell's murder may have ended in acquittal, but the message was clear. This was a case of state-sanctioned violence, and it was not the first, nor the last. The death of Tyre Nichols, a broken system exposed. It was another winter night in Memphis, Tennessee, when Tyre Nichols, a 29-year-old black man, was driving home from his job at FedEx. Nichols had no criminal history. He had no reason to believe he would never make it home that night. He had just left work, tired and ready to see his family. But what should have been a routine night turned into an unimaginable nightmare. When Tyre was pulled over by the police, the officers claimed they had stopped him for reckless driving. What followed was a violent encounter that ended with Tyre Nichols in the hospital, unconscious, and eventually dead. The details surrounding his death were murky, and the police department's version of events only seemed to add more questions than answers. The officers claimed Tyre had fled on foot and fought them when they attempted to arrest him. But that was far from the truth. What happened after the stop was a brutal display of unchecked aggression. Tyre, confused and afraid, was dragged from his vehicle and savagely beaten by 5 officers. It wasn't just a scuffle, it was a prolonged assault, a savage attack that left Nichols bloodied and battered. The officers, as they took turns pummeling him, showed no regard for his life. The beating continued for minutes, while Nichols cried for his mother, the sounds of his desperate pleas captured on body camera footage. The tragedy of Tyre Nichols' death went largely unnoticed by the public until the body cam footage was released. What followed was an outpouring of grief and outrage. The world watched in horror as Nichols was beaten beyond recognition by 5 police officers, all of whom were black. The racial dynamics of the officers' identities added a complicated layer to the narrative. Many had hoped that black officers would treat black citizens with more care, but the brutality revealed something far darker. The outrage was deafening. The footage, once released, sent shockwaves throughout the nation. People saw Tyre Nichols, a man with no criminal background, treated like an animal. His family was left devastated, unable to comprehend how this could have happened. Protests broke out in Memphis, and the call for justice grew louder. The police tried to deflect blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. Tyre Nichols had been murdered, and the officers responsible had acted with impunity. Despite the mounting pressure, the investigation moved slowly. There were questions about the response time, about how the officers had been able to continue their violence unchecked, and why they weren't immediately charged. The justice system moved sluggishly, but as the evidence continued to build, it was clear that the police had not only violated their duty, but had also been complicit in covering up their actions. The trial that followed would be one of the most high-profile cases in Memphis history, and it left the city with one haunting question. How many more victims would be sacrificed before the system finally addressed the deep-rooted corruption within its ranks? The Rampart scandal. Corruption within the LAPD. It all started innocently. The LAPD's Rampart division was known for its hard-hitting tactics, a branch of the police force that prided itself on being the toughest. For years, the officers of Rampart were heralded as the ones keeping the streets of Los Angeles safe. Their reputation for handling high-risk situations and tackling street gangs was formidable. No one had any reason to question the legitimacy of their actions. But beneath this surface of law and order, something much darker was lurking, a festering wound hidden behind the blue uniforms and badges. And it would only take one small mistake to unravel everything. Rafael Perez was a decorated officer in Rampart, known for his sharp instincts and aggressive approach. He was exactly the kind of officer the department wanted on its front lines. But when a botched drug deal brought him to the attention of investigators, a series of confessions began to spill out. Confessions that would go on to change the face of Los Angeles policing forever. At first, it was just one officer in trouble. But when Perez began talking, it became clear this was no isolated incident. The first few admissions were shocking. He spoke of planting evidence to secure arrests, stealing drugs during busts, and falsifying reports to cover up violent acts. But as the investigation continued, the magnitude of the corruption began to snowball. Perez wasn't the only one. He began naming names, leading investigators down a path that would reveal a network of officers embedded in criminal enterprises. They had been in bed with drug dealers for years, providing protection in exchange for cash and stolen goods. Rampart wasn't just a police division. It had become a criminal organization in disguise. As the full extent of the scandal began to surface, the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. Rampart officers had been involved in everything from drug trafficking to extortion. They planted drugs on innocent civilians to make their arrests seem legitimate. They falsified evidence, ruining lives and sending the wrong people to prison. Brutal beatings of suspects and even innocent bystanders had been covered up. Rampart wasn't just corrupt, it was a cesspool of violence and deceit where the rules didn't apply. For the people of Los Angeles, the shock was paralyzing. The LAPD had always been a symbol of authority, the shield meant to protect citizens. But this scandal shattered that trust. Thousands of cases were brought into question. People who had been convicted on false charges suddenly found themselves released from prison, their names cleared after years of suffering. Innocent victims, wronged by the very people who were supposed to protect them, were left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. Investigators uncovered countless examples of brutality that had never been reported, of officers who acted with impunity and unchecked authority. For years they had manipulated the justice system, and they had done it with the knowledge that no one would stop them. But the public, the city of Los Angeles, demanded answers. Rampart officers were fired, arrested, and prosecuted. Yet for many the scars ran too deep. The damage to the community's trust in law enforcement would take decades to repair. The Rampart scandal, as it came to be known, was a devastating reminder of how far police corruption could go when left unchecked, and how fragile trust in a system meant to protect could be when that system betrayed the very people it swore to serve. The Dirty War: Police Brutality and Corruption in Argentina. In the late 1970s, Argentina plunged into one of the darkest periods of its history. The country was under a brutal military dictatorship, and fear hung thick in the air. For the people of Argentina, it seemed as though the world had changed overnight. What was once a thriving democracy became a nightmare of disappearances, torture, and murder. Thousands of citizens vanished, and the police, the very force meant to ensure safety, became the enforcers of a totalitarian regime. They weren't just turning a blind eye to the abuses of power. They were part of it, complicit in the terror that ripped apart families, friends, and entire communities. The military junta ruled with an iron fist, but it wasn't just the army's actions that terrorized the country. It was the police. Officers were ordered to arrest, detain, and disappear anyone suspected of opposition to the regime. There was no trial, no due process, only fear. In the streets, homes were raided in the dead of night. Detainees were taken to secret torture centers where they were beaten, electrocuted, and ultimately silenced forever. The police, often under the direction of the military, took part in the worst atrocities, carrying out orders to disappear anyone who was a threat to the junta's power. As time went on, the violence escalated. The police, once a symbol of law and order, became agents of state-sponsored terror. They would arrest families, strip away the very essence of their lives, and wipe them from existence. And for years no one would question them. The truth was hidden from the public eye, locked away in a web of lies and secrets. But like all cover-ups, it couldn't last forever. After the fall of the dictatorship in 1983, the truth slowly began to surface. Survivors, those who had managed to escape the wrath of the regime, began to speak out. The stories were harrowing. The police had been the ones knocking on doors, dragging away loved ones, and worse. They had been the ones torturing people in hidden basements, getting away with murder in the name of protecting a dictatorship. Their involvement was no longer a rumor, it was fact. And as the testimonies flooded in, the full scale of the conspiracy began to emerge. The survivors spoke of police officers who had gleefully carried out the most unspeakable acts of cruelty. The officers weren't just following orders, they were complicit in creating an atmosphere of fear. They were the ones who destroyed evidence, concealed bodies, and covered up the truth. The state had created a machine of repression, and the police were a key part of its operation. In the face of international pressure and demands for justice, the survivors called for accountability. They demanded to know where their loved ones had gone, who had orchestrated their disappearances, and most importantly, who would be held responsible. The investigation into the police's role in the dirty war unearthed an unimaginable depth of depravity. As more details emerged, it became clear that police officers had participated in hundreds, if not thousands, of disappearances. But even as the officers were brought to trial, the pain and scars remained. The Argentine people had been betrayed by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. The trust between the people and their police force was shattered, and the damage done by the corruption ran deeper than anyone could have anticipated. The dirty war, as it became known, left an indelible mark on the history of Argentina, a constant reminder of the police's complicity in one of the worst human rights abuses in modern history. The Phoenix police shooting scandal, excessive force and cover-up. The air was thick with tension that night in Phoenix, Arizona. What was supposed to be a routine call, a shoplifting suspect, just another night in a busy city, would soon spiral into something far more dangerous. The suspect, Michael, was sitting in his car when the officers arrived. They commanded him to exit the vehicle. But as the officers approached, Michael made a sudden movement. That was all it took. Within seconds, gunshots rang out, and the young man was dead. The Phoenix Police Department's statement was quick. They claimed Michael had posed a threat, reaching for something inside his vehicle. They said they had no choice but to defend themselves. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. A bystander had been recording the entire encounter. The footage that emerged from that recording shattered the department's narrative. What the public saw was a police force that had escalated the situation without provocation, a group of officers who had responded to a non-violent suspect with lethal force. The video spread like wildfire. The public's outrage was immediate. The questions began piling up. What had happened that night? Why had the officers shot Michael without giving him a chance to comply? Had they acted recklessly, or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that the Phoenix Police Department was no stranger to controversy. Excessive force had been a pattern, not an anomaly. But this case was different. The public wasn't willing to let this one go. The pressure on the department intensified. But as the investigation gained momentum, something far more disturbing came to light. There was a cover-up underway. Evidence had been tampered with. Witnesses were intimidated into changing their stories. The department, rather than seeking justice, was working overtime to conceal the truth. It became clear this wasn't just about a single police officer's bad judgment. It was about a culture of misconduct that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. As more details emerged, the scandal grew even darker. Whistleblowers came forward, revealing that this was not an isolated incident. Phoenix police officers had been involved in multiple cases of excessive force, but the department had managed to keep them under wraps. The entire system was compromised. What should have been an open and shut case turned into a full-blown crisis. Protests erupted throughout the city. The people of Phoenix demanded answers, and the police department was left scrambling, its reputation in tatters. The fallout was immense. Officers were suspended, fired, and charged. The scandal became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, a system that had allowed officers to abuse their power with impunity. The Phoenix police shooting scandal was a painful reminder that justice doesn't always prevail, and that the institutions designed to protect the public can sometimes be the very ones that fail them.